Welcome, everyone. All right, I think we're live. Excellent. This is the second of 4 webinars diving into key elements of the iMasons 2024 State of the Industry Report we launched last month. This segment is focused on power. A few quick reminders before we get started. This is an interactive session and we do want your input. You can submit your questions in the comments section and we'll be addressing them as we go along. I also encourage you to provide your thoughts in the comments and engage with other audience members in discussion on the topic. All this content is important and will be utilized as we expand on the report for the rest of this year. So thank you again for spending your valuable time with us and for your contributions. So my name is Dean Nelson. I'm the founder and chairman of Infrastructure Masons. We are a professional association of 6,000 people representing over $200 billion in digital infrastructure projects across 130 countries. We launched our community in 2016 to unite the builders of the digital age. Today, we are proud to have united the industry on a greater digital future. Over the last year, we engaged with over 500 contributors across 50 countries to gather their input for this report. This included one-on-one conversations with owners of some of the largest digital infrastructure platforms in the world, to member meetings, advisory council sessions, and collaboration work stops with our strategic partners. In accordance with iMasons' values, all content was anonymized except where noted. The content gathered from members was then used to create the State of the Industry report that you will hear more about later today. And I'm going to stop and disturb here. One second. Getting lots of text messages. This report provides a holistic picture of the importance on digital infrastructure and a guide to strategic decisions about where, when, and how digital infrastructure is built, operated, and maintained. iMasons believes it is essential that this growth occurs in an economically, ecologically, and socially responsible and sustainable manner. So first, let's baseline. In 2021, iMasons reported that the digital infrastructure industry included 7 million data center locations around the world with a combined capacity of 105 gigawatts and an annual electricity consumption of 594 terawatt hours, representing 2.4% of the global electricity draw. Based on our research, demand for electronic services will double capacity needs over the next 5 years and could triple the size of the industry over the next decade, primarily driven by AI. I've been in the industry for 35 years now, and I have never seen any demand like this. The rate of growth we are seeing now is staggering. This isn't a bubble or a fad. Global demand for AI services are driving new innovations that are being integrated into real business solutions at a pace we have never seen before. It's absolutely incredible. On the flip side, our global member discussions identified 4 critical challenges to fulfill this unprecedented demand. These global challenges center on access to power capacity, attracting and retaining people, addressing industry perception to ensure that we are a good neighbor where we operate, and maintaining our commitments to protect the planet. So that's power, people, perception, and planet. Today, we are focused on the number one identified challenge, access to power. And I'm excited to have Colby Cox from DC Byte joining me today to dig into this topic deeper. A little bit about Colby before we start. Colby is the managing director of the Americas for DC Byte. They are a global data center research and advisory firm. He has been in the data center industry for close to a decade, and he previously worked at QTS. In his role, he leads the strategic vision and execution of the company's platform, which offers a complete and accurate view of the global data center market, covering both co-location and self-build enterprise assets. Colby and his firm were instrumental in providing insights into the global capacity metrics that are shown in our report. This includes tracking of that global growth in almost real time, and you'll see that today. So welcome, Colby. Thanks for joining me here.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, there is so much content to go through here. So let me first do this. In my opening, I introduced the baseline of data center power capacity and growth projections that we gather from our interviews and cross-reference with your platform. So let's start there. So first question, where are we? Can you give me some stats on the growth released to the global and also for each of the different regions, Americas, APAC, and EMEA?
Yeah, so I think the really interesting part, and I think we have some slides that we can show as well. Yeah, so to hit with global, to kind of start with, if we can go down to the updated, where we started was really interesting because ultimately we looked at several different markets. The global data center industry, there should be one that shows an updated version. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. No worries. I think what we're looking at is this is the baseline we started at the report itself.
Yep.
These numbers that came out of the report. I think this is current.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah, so here's the baseline. I think the interesting part when you talk about a global scale, from the time we released this report to now, we've
Mm-hmm.
added 11,369 megawatts across the industry. And that is recognizing that this is a very fluid market, that we are constantly having to keep up with, because by the time we update it, we need to update another couple megawatts, gigawatts. It's just a constant evolution of the space.
Right.
So 11,369 is a really strong number to look at now, and it's going to continue to grow. If you go down into the Americas, I
Well,
think when you
hold on a second, Colby. I want to back up for a second because you jumped to the punchline already. The point is, when we released this report, we had 95,000, right, megawatts globally across this, right? Your four different categories: the live, being built, committed, and early stage. So in those numbers themselves, then we start going into each of the sections. So like for globally, I think we see this one. I guess your definitions: live is what people are consuming right now, under construction, of course, and committed to the development of it, and then the early stage. So those numbers, like if we start at global and then go back into each, like the Americas, if you double click onto that, and Rachel, if you could show that slide, like this is what we're meeting. The numbers you're talking about as far as growth just in that time frame are staggering already. But this alone at the beginning is big, right? When we first released the support back on April 17th.
Oh God, yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting with the Americas, you look at the overall growth. I mean, just
Mm-hmm.
looking at right now, we're just south of the 8 gigawatts in total. Yeah, and you can see kind of those four buckets there. So we look at those four main sections. If you
Mm-hmm.
look at the current numbers, the way that it adds up, we're at 17,660 megawatts, 66 megawatts of live
Mm-hmm.
today,
Mm-hmm.
6,159 of under construction, 11,407 in committed, and 12,645 megawatts in early stage. So big jumps across each
Absolutely.
section of these.
Well, tell you what, why don't we just go and get everybody on the baseline? So you saw the global numbers at 95,000 megawatts. America's was at 41,000. Again, this is as the release of 417. So go to the next one, and this goes back into, I believe, to APAC. APAC had 30,000, right, megawatts, 30 gigawatts of capacity across those categories. And then if we look at EMEA, right, we're at 24,000 megawatts. So let's dive in a little bit deeper, Colby, now on your other ones, because these numbers are incredibly, right? They're huge already. And the vacancy rates over the last 18 months have been driving this, right? We're at record lows, like 3 to 6% across the board, right?
Yep.
But I believe that let's go into the numbers specifically, because I believe we've got a comparison here of the numbers you just outlined. So if you go to the next slide, let's touch on that globally.
So globally, the interesting part from a global standpoint, this is where when you're looking at these numbers, I think the interesting part to see here, as I mentioned, it's 11,369 total growth. But when you look at the various numbers and the increases, I mean, they're very significant increases across each. Globally, I'll just kind of highlight this on globally in the interest of time to kind of go through. But
Mm-hmm.
1.8 gigawatts, almost 1.9 gigawatts of live capacity added, 1.3 gigawatts of under construction capacity, just north of 3 gigawatts of committed capacity were added since this report initially came out. 5,000 gigawatts of capacity added in the early stage across the globe. So pretty staggering numbers when you're breaking these things down individually.
Mm-hmm. So if you look at it, 11 gigawatts added just since this thing. I think we're talking about like 5 months. It's incredible as we looked at these numbers. I mean, we're talking gigawatts here, people. This isn't just like the 100 megawatts or whatever. We're talking 1,000 megawatts at a time. And we've done almost 12 of those in the last 5 months on top of the numbers we've got. So if we go into the Americas, it's the largest growth, as you were saying, almost 8 gigawatts.
Yep. Yeah, largest growth, almost 8 gigawatts. And I think when you look at the Americas side, where the biggest swath of growth, I will say, has come from the initial numbers that were shared, were really going to come from the early stage side. So when
Mhm.
you look at that committed and early stage, the initial numbers, if you remember back to the couple slides, we were 9 gigawatts and 10 gigawatts. These are the current numbers as of literally yesterday. Yeah, so 11 gigawatts, 12, north of 12 and a half gigawatts. Yeah, so pretty significant increases. And these aren't even looking at projects that may have been announced recently that we haven't even had a chance to enter in and keep up with. Yeah, so
Mhm.
pretty staggering increases.
Yeah, let's jump into APAC because we've got 8 gigawatts across America, the Americas themselves. APAC's not slacking.
No, APAC is definitely moving very fast. APAC's pretty interesting. The 2.3 gigawatts in total growth from the time to now, 11. Yeah, so initially we started with 8.9 live in APAC. It's now at 11.2. Under construction at 2.8. So not as much of an increase in the under construction, but you see about 1,000, close to 1,000 added in both committed and early stage, because both were in the early or the low nines, 9,000s, that is, megawatts. And now we're both pushing into and getting close to the 11,000 or 11 gigawatt range. So it really does start to break it down and see this growth is happening globally. Yeah, and we'll get into some of the other discussions around each as we go through this.
Yeah, and what I love about your platform is it shows where this growth is happening at the different stages. So you can see the dots on the right. So let's jump back into EMEA as well, and
Yeah,
give us some
Mia.
insights there.
Yeah, EMEA is an interesting one because I think when you look at EMEA, it hasn't seen the as significant of a volume of growth. So when you look at the historical number, it's really added about 300 megawatts in the live category. Under construction, you're looking at about 140 megawatts added. In the committed section, you are seeing closer to the 300 megawatts added, and then same with early stage. So you're seeing more investment, and some of that is definitely coming from international investment heading into kind of London and some of those markets, kind of the LFD side of it. Yeah, so you can start to see where some of that will be impacted, but
Hmm.
definitely still significant growth in a market that is, I think, obviously, as you can tell by the dots on that map, a little more constrained for land access.
Yeah, a little more concentrated. Okay, here we've looked at global, Americas, APAC, and EMEA. Can you extrapolate for us, get an idea? We talked about the doubling. I think we know that the doubling is going to be happening, but the tripling of the overall capacity. What do the trends show you as you start to extrapolate?
So it's interesting when I look at the numbers right now, and I'm always going to lean on the side of being somewhat conservative to not go too crazy with the numbers. Yeah, but at the same time, if I just look at a very simplistic view, figure the data center industry's been around for, I mean, a pretty long amount of time at this point, very minute, very minor in the grand scheme of things, but just say 15 years, just for argument's sake,
Sure,
as of right
sure.
now.
Hmm.
So in the last 15 years, we've built the industry up to 115 gigawatts. Based on the data we're seeing today, that if you look at how the industry is going to evolve, maintaining the AI growth and the capacity, excluding some of the challenges we'll face with getting it there, but just looking at it from this angle, between June 24 and December 29, based on how much is continues to be funneled in, that time frame has the potential to add 100 and close to 127 gigawatts. Yeah, in that amount of time, if construction projects, if land projects keep pushing forward. And I think you can even start to you have to focus on some of the challenges, which is the reason we're having the conversation. So we'll talk about that because
Sure, sure.
reality and other things are different. And then you start just looking at the bigger side of it. I mean, that's almost all land acquisition right now. But you look at how NVIDIA's been moving along with the chips, how many chips are sitting there ready to be shipped. There's folks that will talk about 900 tons of chips that NVIDIA has that could impact that number. I mean, it just starts to get maddening when you think about the growth some of these things can have. And
Sure.
then even just kind of talking, and we'll go into some of this further down too, but even just the investment that's being made. So when we talk about the serious nature of this, I mean, we're not talking companies spending a couple $100 million. That'll barely get you a seat at the table these days. We're talking companies that are literally in the 20 billion, if not starting to push 100 billion mark of investments that they're looking at. So this is pretty intensive business we're talking about.
Yeah, number one for me is always follow the money, and where the investments are happening is where things are going to grow. And actually, a question came back in from Mark Teeley about GDP correlation. So, is there a direct correlation between global GDP growth and the growth in technology power consumption? Do you see any connection between that?
Um, I'm not typically looking at it from that angle, so I don't know that I'd have a great answer right now for it because I don't typically break it down. We stay pretty hardened on the basic facts and elements of what we're
Hmm.
looking at. Yeah, but I think you could certainly make that correlation, and then start to also weigh that in with some of the challenges that may be upcoming.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you just look at um, technology or digital infrastructure is a great equalizer. And so it enables everyone to participate within the digital economy. So, Mark, I believe there is a tie to that, just with where the demand is. And we're also going to talk about some of these growth markets that are underserved at the moment. And their GDP growth, I think, is correlated directly to the amount of digital infrastructure that is actually is deployed. So speaking of that, why don't we zoom in a little bit and let's go into those three growth regions. So Africa, India, and Latin America. And the reason that we put these together in the report was they represent 44% of the world's population at 3.5 billion people with a median age of 28. That number is important. Yet they have less than 5% of the global data center capacity. So if you want to see where the next wave will be, that's it. The youth will drive this as they are the next generation of consumers and are hungrier than anyone else before. So can you give us a little insights on the growth in Latin America, India, and Africa, also since the report was released?
Yeah, I mean, I think we start with Africa. So Africa is a pretty interesting one. I mean, there's
Hmm.
there's a list of things you can focus in on Africa country to country. And you can see where the dots kind of position it. But you're looking at roughly right now about a 21% increase,
Hmm.
adding 53 megawatts since the initial report. I think the really unique part about Africa that is really an optimistic look at it because you look at the total live is currently sitting at 307 megawatts.
Hmm.
But each one of the other phases represents healthy growth across all of it. So it's long-term investment, long-term commitment to expanding a market that has vast amounts of folks. There's a lot of potential for these regions to really start to come in and have the
Hmm.
land accessibility, all the things that are there. So I think Africa is super unique, and it's going to be one that we are going to stay very focused in on. And we'll go into some of the details with some of the key markets of Africa here in a little bit. But even dropping into Latin America,
Well,
yeah,
before you go there, for Africa itself, though, just for everybody's information, 1.4 billion people, an average age of 18. That's the median age. So again, this is the youngest population out there with a very vast amount of land, but also underserved across the board. So let's jump into Latin America next. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Latin America, has the largest increase. There's definitely a lot of effort going in. There's been a lot of subsea cable activity. There's new power stations in Brazil, which a lot of folks are looking at right now.
Hmm.
Substations, one in particular build. I'll be at that here in 2 weeks down in Sao Paulo. But Latin America has been an interesting one because in essence, you're really kind of focused in on the largest megawatt growth, smallest percentage growth. I believe it was the smallest percentage growth at 13%, but
Hmm.
122. And you're even seeing within Latin America, I believe right now, it's been very focused on Mexico, Brazil, a couple key markets. I think with some of the challenges again that were the core foundation of this conversation, that are reasons why you're seeing some of that shift into Colombia and some neighboring countries. So it does start to get very unique, but a market that is just sitting ripe for this type of activity. Yeah, and I think based on how they're progressing things, we're going to get there really quickly. Yeah, and we're going to
Hmm.
ultimately have to start seeing that built out more and more as we go along.
Yeah. And again, high concentration of people, a lot of land, and underserved. Same thing. Cool. So let's go into India because this is a whole nother beast here.
Yeah, so India, this is definitely the largest of those of the three that we're comparing in this sake. I mean, only an 89 megawatt increase, which doesn't seem big. But I think the big thing to focus on India, similar to with Africa, it's obviously heavy on the committed and early stage. But if you look at the lower levels of this, I mean, committed at 1.6 gigawatts, early stage at 3.1 gigawatts, almost 3.2, that represents that there's going to be significant growth coming to these markets when they're able to capture the power, when they're able to move forward through everything that they're going to need to. And I think ultimately this market is going to continue to see that, along with some of the neighboring countries that will be around in the general area and pushing around. So I think there's some uniqueness coming to each of these in these emerging markets where you may have some more accessibility to some of the key components that we're going to ultimately need. And to your point about labor wise, it's significantly largest labor pool you're going to have, very well
Hmm.
versed in what we're looking at. I think there's just so much potential for what India could end up accomplishing.
Yeah, and I remember being over there in 2019, and we had this debate, and I said, "This is going to become a 10 gigawatt region without a doubt, right? Like, no
Mhm.
way, we don't even have a gigawatt." And like, but no one saw what was going on with AI coming and those things. But again, a very, very focused technology based workforce. I mean, that has been leveraged globally already, but a very big country with a lot of people. And so, yeah, these numbers are, they will probably exceed the other locations very quickly because they are the largest across our focused areas.
Yep.
So, um, one reminder about this is that these numbers are being driven due to a lack of available capacity, and we are at an all-time low from a vacancy rate. So my next question to you, Colby, is why are we here? We have constraints all over the place. Why is that? Give us your perspective.
Yeah, so my perspective, I actually go back a little bit further than where everybody says the I don't know, second wave, whatever you want to call it, the boom of AI.
Hmm.
I go back and really take this back to COVID. And I think if you take a very broad look at this and realize some of the early challenges that we had, COVID really kicked off a lot of that because all of a sudden we had a slowdown in data center activity, minor slowdown, I mean, a couple months at most. But realistically, you had companies that started working from home. They weren't coming in. The usage they had was shifting. Supply chain was impacted. We started to see then coming back off of that. And when that started to die down a little bit, folks started evaluating how do we want to work with cloud? What do we want to do with our on-prem facilities that are sitting at our corporate building that nobody goes to anymore because we're fully remote for the foreseeable future back then, and ultimately start understanding where we at. And I think that's when we initially could kind of go back and bump up and show an increase in the data center activity starting back then.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we had challenges with supply chain got really exacerbated at that point in time. So we already were a little bit behind coming into that. I think when you start looking at that and the amount of cloud repatriation that was even happening with the early adopters, then you start breaking into to all of a sudden we get this onslaught of AI that hit us, which AI is not new, but the current version we're living in is certainly something we weren't expecting or seeing in the grand
Yeah.
scheme of things. And
Adoption.
that, yeah, exactly. And now all of a sudden you have these campuses that a couple of years ago we were talking about, oh, people are going to sign a 300 megawatt deal. It's like, well, okay, but what about the gigawatt deals, the multiple gigawatt deals, the plus gigawatt deal? All these things started happening where deals got bigger and bigger and bigger, campuses got bigger. We were corrected from some of the supply chain issues, but now all of a sudden you start recognizing the power starts to become one of the limiting factors, because all of the sudden when we start to see the sunlight through the clouds, we recognize now we have massive increases to where we're seeing gigawatt jumps over and over and over and over again, that all of a sudden our utility grid, which Mark Gonzi talked about this back in 2022, I think his prediction was in 5 years we were going to run out of power. And it's one of those things that it's kind of happening here. And we need to really start figuring out how are we going to adapt, because that snowballing effect that COVID kicked off, I don't know that we can confidently say we've ever fully broken out of that.
Just look at the supply chain constraints that persist. Ask any of the suppliers. I see these presentations all the time. They have the same thing. It all comes down to resources in the right place and the demand and delivering within the window that's needed. And everyone is demanding it. So the biggest buyers, biggest companies in the world are pushing for it. So yeah, I agree with you. This wave that really did start with COVID. And I remember I had a conversation with Noelle Walsh at Microsoft when during the pandemic when we started doing live sessions like this, and she threw a number out that blew my mind away then. She said, we've added 100 megawatts of capacity in the last 2 weeks, like 2 to 4 weeks. I'm like, in less than a month, just in their portfolio. But that was because of massive growth as far as people were needed because they're all stuck at home. So you look at that, everyone thought that was going to be a peak and then it would go back down. No, 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 no. New baseline, new baseline, new baseline. And then you get AI that hit. So absolutely agree with you. So it is snowballing. I think what you were saying before, like this is all compounding the problem. And is an interesting question that came in here around the capacity as well, saying that you think about the running out of oil 40 or 50 years ago. Do we have to start to think differently about this? So this goes into my next question. If we have incredible power constraints, and we have limitations of what can be delivered because, not in my backyard when it comes down to electrical distribution, right? Or generation or those types of things. What compromises, I guess, are being made because of these constraints? So give us a perspective there.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting when you look at that, because ultimately it's really not that much of a generation, it's a transmission issue. Yeah, and it's understanding how are we going to do that while also meeting a lot of the sustainability initiatives that we have globally and country to country. I think the interesting thing is you start looking at ways some of the states are tackling it. Very recent in the news, it's been talked about for a long time, but what Quantum Loophole has been doing in Maryland and how that's worked is really unique when you look at how Governor Moore and that whole thing got pushed through, because ultimately there's tax incentives in that for all
Sure.
of the money that the data center industry can bring back into a local region, then is how much of that is going towards power, how much of that is going towards sustainability. So they've actually outlined that quite well, which is very nice. You also, I think, start to see some of the utility providers tackling things in different ways. I think historically you look at, and I'm going to use North Carolina as a little bit of an example with Duke. Historically, most data center operators, I need well, they wouldn't have said these numbers, but 100 megawatts and I'll use what I use of it and go from there. So one of the things that Duke is kicking around right now is literally charging for full power when they use it or not, or regardless of if they use it or not. So if you say you need it, that's a big thing. Like, I'm not now just going to go on your goodwill and say, okay, tell me you need a gigawatt, but you use 200 kW because, or 200 megawatts, because now I'm stranding that. I have to keep it available for you. They're also even looking and this will be an interesting one, we'll see, but yeah, potentially having the operators help with some of the substations and costs and how they're doing it. You have other markets where down in the Southwest where some of the utility providers are putting caps on the size of the projects that you can look at. So quite literally, if you want 25 megawatts, you can get it. Or you're not going to get it. If you want 24, there's a high likelihood you're going to have access to that, which makes it super unique. And even looking at some of the others, I mean, just trying to determine how you go through this, I think you have to look at the alternatives of the nuclear side, of how you're going to go through that, and look at what some of the other regions have done. We're shutting coal down. Germany's shutting nuclear down. France is super heavy on nuclear. You just have to look at region to region, kind of how they're tackling this the grid limitations, the aging infrastructure, and how the demand has just exacerbated that whole thought process and talk stream has really been very interesting with how do we get there. But to even add a layer of that makes it challenging is, I'll use a really good example. I live in West Virginia. I drive into Northern Virginia. Obviously, everybody's aware of NIMBY and the things that are taking shape in Northern Virginia and really kind of everywhere right now. One of the harder parts around all of the utility talk that we have is even being able to get the transmission lines in, because you're going through multiple municipalities. You're having to deal with multitudes of what you would typically do with one region. So all of a sudden now, it's not even just NIMBYs. My way into the office every day, as soon as I hit Virginia, it's no new lines for Loudon are the signs that are popping up all over the place. So now even just to get the power, it becomes challenging. Then you even start talking about the flip side of that in the state that I live in. And in West Virginia, the citizens and the folks are starting to catch on to it and recognizing we're building solar, we're doing all these things. You want our power, but it's going there. How do we capitalize on that and keep it in our state? And then we take advantage of some of those. So there's a lot of really interesting questions. Natural gas, how do you get to some of these different technology needs? The simple fact is we're going to have to, as an industry, figure out what we're going to do for the foreseeable future, because none of it is a quick fix that we're going to have. So it's going to be fixes. We're going to get through it. Will ultimately be fine because we've got some of the most intelligent people in the world in this industry. So we'll get it. We've just got to be very focused on how we go about doing it.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, is that the compromises are being made as people are reconsidering how to do this. So you think of natural gas. We want to get to renewable energy, but we don't have enough generation that's consistent in the right places. And so we got to figure out a base load, like bridge between these things, and sequestration and other things, as we outline in the report as well, that we have to stay focused in on how we achieve net zero carbon for the infrastructure as we triple over the next 10 years, right? So I think that SMRs and all these other aspects are playing into it.
Yeah, and that's why you start to see the locations that people are selecting start to vary. Yeah, you start to see people go into smaller data center known states, so to speak. Typically call them tertiary markets that have just now become, I mean, gigawatt scale wise, they could end up being a tier 2 market if you really wanted to break them down. But you start to see that even when you start looking at overseas with APAC as an example, it's very similar to here. The mature markets in APAC are the ones that are having the harder time with power. So Japan and Korea constrained. If I go to emerging markets, it's really good. If I'm in Singapore and there's a moratorium in place because of potential power challenges, well, literally right across from my window is Johor in Malaysia.
Right. Yeah.
And they're welcoming everything. Yeah, so it's all coming in, and you look at, I think something to kind of interesting angle on it as well is even you go into some of the other areas, and I'm probably going to bleed into something else we're going to talk about here, but yeah, even if you talk about in Africa as an example with what Morocco is doing, yeah, and the Eureka Park project that they have going on there. Yeah, so it's literally establishing, I believe it's a 386 megawatt data center and AI hub. Yeah, and then they've got a 580 megawatt solar project that they're doing that's going to hit to 4 different power plants. So I think it really starts to get unique. What countries can we do these things in? What countries can we not? I know Africa and some of these other markets were a big focus as well. Like Nigeria is an example. That could be a really difficult market. I think there's going to be successes that we'll see. But with the price of petrol and diesel, all the different things that we're seeing go across with how they are able to do it today, I think we're going to continue to face challenges. So we just have to look and be open to alternative markets where we can potentially do these things.
Yeah, let me tie this together, because I think that if you look at the examples that you were giving, this alludes to a concept that we introduced within the paper called clean energy zones. And I think that what got us here will not get us there. We've been organically growing in populous areas on purpose because we needed to have this infrastructure, quote unquote, closer to the user. Then we started moving things out to these higher concentrated areas. But again, we weren't really master planning this from I think, a population and an industry standpoint. So the concept that we've outlined in here is clean energy zones, and they are master planned towns or city-size areas developed around concentrated sources of clean energy to serve multiple industries, including multi-data center complexes, not just for data centers, but literally. So think of this as a fully integrated industrial complex, potentially reaching 10 gigawatts in a location of a capacity serving the businesses and fully integrated with the community. So imagine balancing economics, ecology, and the social elements in master planning something like this. So that clean energy zone is something that is trending across a lot of the big players, but also the governments, economic development offices and things. We need them to step back and think about it, especially in the emerging markets. If we are constrained in other areas, what do we learn from that? And how will we do this? And then in the actual established markets, where and how do we do this? How do we incentivize this? So give us your thoughts on clean energy zones.
I love them. I mean, you knock out so many positive things with a clean energy zone. You address the community concerns right out of the gate. That has to be there because that's you hear a lot of talk as well about the perception and things of the industry. Address the community concerns. That helps us tremendously going forward. Yeah, and finding those spots to do this, yeah, where they have the land and the ability to do it, I think is also great because reality is that's going to put you away from more of the communities, and you can have your edge locations closer to the community so you can still achieve everything that you need to achieve. The other interesting part of this is why I think it makes a ton of sense, because we're facing a lot of load studies. If you go to markets today, they're going to tell you, yes, I can 100% get you an extra gigawatt in 10 years. Yeah, so you're going to wait anyways. Let's start having these conversations. And I think a really good spot and way to think about it is looking at data center world this year. There was a lot of talk about nuclear. One of the things that I thought was incredibly interesting was they mentioned there were 37 states that have some conversation, some sort of legislation. They're actively looking at ways to do nuclear. It's a conversation that's happened for a long time, but we're finally taking it serious. I think going to those markets and looking at those regions to start with would be a phenomenal idea. Use AWS as a perfect example. I thought this the moment I heard of this. Yeah, that just changed the whole dynamic of nuclear in the vein of this conversation. When AWS acquired the Cumulus site in Pennsylvania, they didn't try to build SMRs. They didn't do any of that. I think if you want to be a very, very simplistic about it, they held everybody's hand and said, look, we're going to walk you up to this. Check it out. It's not the big bad wolf. It's going to be okay. We can all do this, and we can find advanced ways to do it. And it kind of comes to the concept of, you look at Field of Dreams. Field of Dreams is a great movie, and it was always, if you build it, they will come. Right. I think we need to look at it in a different way and say, they've built it. Go there. Like, it's already there. Let's just go to it. Let's go find that. Go find industrialized zones where you can build it and have a power hub in the middle, and everybody works on the outer circles of it, and it's a contained environment. Everybody's there together. It really does start to take all of these great locations, whether it's a brownfield coal site, it's an old nuclear facility. How can we re-architect those, assuming we have the land to do so, and make them into these visions of the future, because they're ultimately going to be there. And I think it's dispelling a lot of myths that people have. I'll give you an example. I grew up in upstate New York in Rochester. Well, if you're familiar with New York, you'll call it Western New York. That's the correct way to say it. But in Rochester, New York, on Lake Ontario, there was a Ginna nuclear power plant on the lake 2 miles from my school. Yeah, we literally, and most people have never done these, I guess, but growing up next to a nuclear plant, you get a different appreciation for it. Yeah, but we would do in school, we would do nuclear drills to just, hey, if something happens, if there's a worrisome event, we'll do this. And that was just second nature. So the reason I bring that up, it's not a scare. It's folks that have been around nuclear, have lived next to these plants. You're going to have a lot easier time talking to those folks about SMRs, about new technologies, because they understand today's nuclear. They see exactly what we can do. So I think it does start to get very interesting when you break those things down.
Yeah, and I think that each of the areas have to consider how do they serve the demand? Because for them to participate in the digital economy, they have to have digital infrastructure. And to do that, you have to have power. And to actually have power, you need to integrate this ecologically and economically. So everything we're outlining here is to say there's a balance we've got to achieve for us to actually make this happen. So I think the clean energy zones are super important for us to consider, and to make sure that as we look at every one of those markets themselves, how do you serve the demand in those three ways? Economically, ecologically, and from a social standpoint. So we have a methodology here that will allow it to happen. So all right. Well, Colby, we're running over, but we could keep talking forever. These numbers are incredible. Thank you for joining me, and it was really great to have you on. And also, thanks for the the input and the help across all this stuff, because your information just really helped people get a picture of what's going on. And so, make sure to reach out to it can as well. I think you'll be at Data Cloud. If you'd like some more information, Colby will be available. And as we wrap up, I wanted to remind everyone of the available resources you can leverage as we all, whoops, as we all take on the challenges of power, people, perception, and planet. First is the State of the Industry report and the launch video you will see in the comments. So they'll be sharing that. Second is to watch the People webinar with Heather Dooley. And of course, the Power webinar here will also be available. These are all on the iMasons.org website under the Insights section. So that's iMasons.org/insights. Finally, please join me for the next two webinars in our series. On May 21st, I'll be joined by Miranda Gardner, Executive Director of the iMasons Climate Accord, to address planet challenges and how we avoid growth at all costs. This is a big one. And finally, on May 30th, Siri Denny from Schneider Electric will be joining me as we dig into industry perception challenges and explore how data centers become good neighbors by balancing industry growth in an economically, ecologically, and socially responsible manner. And Colby, like Peter Parker's uncle said, with great power comes great responsibility. The iMasons community is united in delivering a greater digital future for all. We are serious about this, so let's do it. And thank you everyone for attending.